Carlos Alcaraz sat down with the media in Monaco this week and said two words that may end up defining his entire clay season. Not about his form, about defending the title, or about the draw. Two words about a decision his rival just made. A decision that, on the surface, looks like nothing more than a strong athlete choosing to keep competing while in good shape. But when you understand the numbers behind what Sinner actually did by showing up here this week, 1 week after the Sunshine Double, on a surface where he has 0 points to defend, those two words from Alcaraz stop sounding like admiration and start sounding like something else entirely. Keep watching this video, because most of the coverage this week has completely missed what is actually happening in Monaco. To understand what is really happening this week in Monaco, you need to set aside the surface story, which is that two great rivals are about to meet on clay for the first time in 2026, and the tennis will be spectacular. All of that may be true, but underneath the match previews and the ranking projections and the color pieces about the Mediterranean sun, there is a structural reality unfolding that will define the #1 ranking for the next 2 months, and it has very little to do with whether Sinner can transfer his hard-court form to a red clay surface. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the story lives. Alcaraz enters the clay season defending 4,300 ranking points across 5 events: Monte Carlo, Barcelona, Rome, Roland Garros, and he also has points from Barcelona to protect. He won Monte Carlo last year. He won Roland Garros in a 5-set final against Sinner that lasted 5 hours and 29 minutes and became the longest French Open final in history. He reached the final in Barcelona before losing to Holger Rune. That clay season was, by almost any historical measure, one of the most dominant stretches any player has put together on the surface in the modern era. He went 22 wins and 1 loss from April through June. The 1 loss came to Rune in the Barcelona final. Every other result across 3 Masters 1000 events and a Grand Slam was a title. That is the record he is now defending. Sinner, by contrast, enters this clay swing defending 1,950 points. He has 0 points to defend until the Italian Open in May. The gap between what these two players are asked to protect across the same stretch of calendar is not a slight imbalance. Alcaraz needs to perform at roughly the level he performed at last year, the best clay season he has ever put together, arguably the best any player has put together since the height of Nadal's dominance, just to stay where he is. Sinner needs to perform at any level above a first-round exit in Monte Carlo and Rome, and a second-week presence at Roland Garros, and he will end up ahead. The mathematics of what is required from each player to come out of this clay swing as #1 are as asymmetric as anything this rivalry has produced. And here is where Sinner's decision to play Monte Carlo becomes the move that nobody is calling correctly. He has no obligation to be here. A player who has just won back-to-back Masters 1000 events without dropping a set, who has been competing at the highest level of professional tennis for the better part of 6 weeks straight, would face exactly 0 criticism for skipping the opening clay event and arriving fresh in Barcelona or Madrid. There was genuine speculation in the days after Miami about whether he would enter at all. His doubles partner's own father suggested they would wait and see, acknowledging that Sinner might want to rest. The conventional wisdom in elite sport, particularly in tennis where the calendar is relentless and the clay-to-hard transition demands significant physical adjustment, would support a week of recovery over another tournament. Sinner chose differently. I know the position, the situation, and the scenarios, but it's not one tournament that will define who's #1 or #2. It's a tournament that I love to play, and I'm happy to be here. I will try to win as many matches as possible, but at the same time, there are even more tournaments coming up. When you are a top player, you aim to win trophies. The points are regardless in a way. I watch the race to Turin because there you can see how someone is playing during the year. Read that carefully, and it is, on the surface, the perfectly measured response of a player comfortable in his position and uninterested in the rankings noise. But the reasoning inside it tells a different story. He describes Monte Carlo as a tournament he loves to play. He notes there are even more tournaments coming up. He frames the race to Turin, the year-end points tally, as the real measure of a season rather than individual tournaments. What he doesn't say, and what doesn't need saying because the mathematics say it for him, is that by showing up in Monte Carlo specifically, he has created a scenario in which Alcaraz is defending points against an opponent who is gaining them from zero. Every round Sinner wins this week adds to his total. Every round Alcaraz fails to replicate his performance from last year subtracts from his. That dynamic is not neutral. It is aggressively tilted toward the challenger. The specific ranking scenarios crystallize this further. If Sinner reaches the Monte Carlo semifinals and Alcaraz exits before the quarterfinals, Sinner reclaims number one regardless of anything else that happens. If they meet in the final and Sinner wins, the switchover is guaranteed. If Alcaraz defends the title and Sinner is eliminated early, the gap actually widens slightly. So the outcomes in which Alcaraz's position is genuinely safe this week are limited to the ones where he performs at or near his best, while Sinner performs at or below expectation. The outcomes in which Sinner gains ground are numerous and require nothing extraordinary, just showing up and going deep into the second week, which is something Sinner has done in Monaco in both of his previous appearances here, reaching the semifinals in 2023 and 2024. And this brings the conversation to something that gets compressed in most of the week's coverage, because the headline is about Alcaraz being surprised, not about the structural danger the decision represents. Monte Carlo is where Alcaraz sits in the most vulnerable position of his clay season, not because of the draw, not because of his recent form, but because of the specific combination of factors that converge here. He is the defending champion, which means every point he earns is already accounted for, and every exit before the final means a net loss. He is arriving from a hard-court swing where he lost 2 of his last 3 matches, including a third-round exit to a 32nd seed in Miami, which has generated public conversation about his mental freshness and whether Patrick Mouratoglou's observation that Alcaraz seemed bored was more diagnostic than anyone wanted to admit. He has stated publicly that he is not thinking about defending a title right now, that he just wants good feelings on the clay, which is a rational and healthy approach to re-entry after a difficult stretch. But it is not the mentality of a player bearing down on 1,000 ranking points with a fresh and hungry challenger waiting in the same half of the draw. What is easy to overlook when you compare the two players' situations entering this week is how profoundly different their relationship with the venue itself is. Alcaraz is arriving as a guest. He won here last year for the first time in his career, having never previously won a match at Monte Carlo before his title run in 2025. The success is real and significant, but it is the success of someone who cracked a code rather than someone returning to familiar ground. Sinner lives here. Monaco is his home. He woke up on the first morning of the tournament in his own apartment. He started practicing on the clay courts earlier in the week than most visiting players because he could simply walk out and do it without factoring in travel, acclimatization, or the subtle accumulation of logistical friction that tournament weeks create for players staying away from their base. Those details sound small. At the margin of elite sport, where the difference between winning and losing a third set is sometimes measured in half a percentage point of freshness, they are not small. Sinner, arriving from the opposite direction, 12-match winning streak, sunshine double completed without a drop set, 34 consecutive sets won at Masters 1000 level, carries none of that weight. He lives in Monaco. He told the media before the tournament began that he has been on court since Thursday after Miami, starting slowly, building back into the clay rhythm that is different from every other surface. He described the process with the kind of specific, measured attention to detail that has characterized his approach to every challenge his team has identified and systematically addressed over the past 2 years. He knows the point situation. He knows the scenarios. He chose to be here anyway, framing it publicly as love for the tournament and a desire to build match sharpness on clay heading into the next events. All of that is true, and it is also strategically optimal. What makes this particular week so consequential is that it is the first domino of a long sequence. The clay season runs from April through June, through 5 major events, and what happens at Monte Carlo shapes not just the rankings, but the psychological architecture of everything that follows. If Sinner takes the number 1 spot here, Alcaraz spends the rest of the clay season in the unusual position of being the challenger on his strongest surface, defending the titles that made him the dominant player on clay, while trying to reclaim a ranking he has held since last September. That reversal of psychological pressure is not trivial. Alcaraz has spoken before about the way his opponents approach matches against him, with more freedom, more aggression, more willingness to go for shots that risk failing. Because beating the world number 1 is always worth more than losing to the world number 1 costs. If Sinner becomes number 1 going into Barcelona and Madrid and Rome, that dynamic flips. And it flips at precisely the point in the calendar where Alcaraz has the most to defend and Sinner has the most to gain. There is also the question of form trajectory, and it points in one direction considerably more clearly than most Alcaraz fans would prefer. Sinner lost the Australian Open semi-final to Djokovic, lost in Doha to Mensik. Then he arrived at Indian Wells, adapted to the conditions early, and did not drop a set for 12 consecutive matches across 2 Masters 1000 events. Alcaraz won 16 consecutive matches to start the year, completed his career Grand Slam at the Australian Open, won in Doha, and then lost in the Indian Wells semifinals to Medvedev and the Miami third round to Korda. The trajectories entering this clay season are heading in opposite directions. Sinner is ascending. Alcaraz is in the early stages of a correction, and while the clay surface, where he has been almost untouchable over the past 2 years, gives him every reason to believe the correction will be sharp and complete, the timing of Sinner's peak is not accidental. There is a historical parallel worth drawing here, and it is one that illuminates the specific texture of what Sinner is doing with his season calendar. When Novak Djokovic began his transformation from a good player to the world's best in the late 2000s, one of the things his team understood earlier than almost anyone else was that being present at tournaments where you have nothing to defend and your rival has everything to defend is not just a ranking opportunity. It is a psychological pressure transfer. You walk in without weight, and your opponent walks in carrying it. Every round you win tightens the mechanism. Every round your opponent loses releases tension they needed to hold. The asymmetry of expectation does things to players that scoreboard analysis does not capture, and it operates most powerfully on a surface like clay, where matches are longer. Physical attrition accumulates across the day and across the week, and the margin between winning and losing a deciding set is often the difference between a player who is mentally fresh and a player who is carrying 3 weeks of accumulated pressure. Alcaraz is carrying that pressure. Sinner is not. The decision to play Monte Carlo is the mechanism by which that asymmetry is applied. Sinner has been transparent about what his team has built since the U.S. Open final last year, when he lost to Alcaraz and gave up the number 1 ranking. Since that defeat, Sinner has won 4 major titles. His serve has been restructured to be simultaneously more accurate and more powerful, a combination that technical analysts pointed out after Miami was physically almost unprecedented at tour level. He has added the drop shot and the net approach as tactical weapons in ways that directly target the patterns Alcaraz has used to disrupt his game in their previous meetings on clay. He is arriving at Monte Carlo with a game that is materially different from the one Alcaraz beat at Roland Garros last year. And he is arriving with 0 ranking points to defend, on a surface where his best results have been consistent semifinal runs, in a tournament where the defending champion is carrying psychological weight from 2 consecutive losses. So when Alcaraz says it surprised him that Sinner came to play, that it shows the great physical condition Sinner is in, what he can do. The charitable reading is that he genuinely finds it impressive. And it is impressive. Any honest reading of what Sinner is doing physically to be ready to compete at this level 1 week after completing the Sunshine Double deserves acknowledgement. But there is another reading. The surprise framing is the response of someone who perhaps expected or hoped that his rival would take the easy path, the conventional path, the path that elite sport logic would have supported. Sinner took the other one. He showed up in Monaco. He is staying at home. He lives here, which itself gives him a logistical and psychological advantage that most visiting players do not have. He is fresh enough to play doubles on top of singles, and he is doing all of it in the tournament where Alcaraz has the single largest standalone points deficit to defend on the entire clay swing. Jannik Sinner will most probably reach the Monte Carlo final. Whether he wins it depends on whether the clay slows the points transition from his serve enough to give Alcaraz's return game the extra fraction of time it needs to do damage, and on whether Alcaraz's clay-specific game comes back to its sharpest form quickly enough after 3 weeks away from the surface. On balance, I think Alcaraz wins that final if they meet. His clay record, his history in this tournament, and the specific tactical vocabulary he has developed against Sinner on slower surfaces all give him the edge in a final. But Sinner reaching it means the ranking is already gone, regardless of Sunday's result, and that is the part Alcaraz's team needs to be thinking about, not from Sunday, but from the moment the first-round matches begin. What that ranking change would actually mean for Roland Garros is worth thinking through carefully, because the instinct is to say that Alcaraz on clay is Alcaraz on clay regardless of the number next to his name. But the Roland Garros final last year, that 5-hour 5-set match, where Alcaraz saved 3 championship points and won the longest final in the tournament's history, was a match that Alcaraz played as world number 1, carrying the weight of expectation, defending his title, with the crowd and the narrative and the calendar all pointing in his direction. If Roland Garros 2026 arrives with Sinner as world number 1, the dynamic is inverted. Sinner walks onto court Philippe Chatrier as the number 1. Alcaraz walks on as the challenger trying to reclaim both the title and the ranking in a single match. The tennis will be the same. The psychological architecture will not be. And in 5-set matches between players of this quality, psychological architecture is sometimes the difference between 3-14 and 3-15 in the 5th set tiebreak. The broader question, and the one this whole scenario raises that I find genuinely fascinating, is whether this clay swing is the first moment in this rivalry where Sinner's strategic intelligence is outpacing Alcaraz's tactical dominance on a surface. They have been described as the 2 best players of this generation, and the tennis conversation tends to focus on their head-to-head results and the shot-by-shot quality of their matches. But what Sinner did by simply entering the draw at Monte Carlo is strategic in a way that sits above the shot-by-shot level. He looked at the